My earliest music memory was as about a 5-year-old. I lived in a very rural town, Vermont, Woodstock, Vermont. And my mother sang in the local theater, and my father played clarinet in the pit orchestra. It was a surreal play by Jean Cocteau called La Tour Eiffel, the Eiffel Tower. And all I can remember was that I wore very few clothes, and I think I was supposed to be like a Cupid or something, and I was asked to throw paper bullets from a very high chair into the audience, and I apparently panicked and didn't do anything, and I remember everybody shouting off stage, "Johnny, throw the bullets, throw the bullets," and I just froze. A few years later, I also wore very few clothes. This time I was trying to appear as a young Polynesian boy in a Concord, New Hampshire local production of South Pacific, and my mother was Bloody Mary. I think my stage appearance there was marginally more successful. There's a lot of music in the family. My mother's stepfather owned a dance hall on the shores of Lake Winnipesaukee in central New Hampshire, and it was there that as a young boy I first heard big bands. Particularly remember hearing the Duke Ellington Orchestra twice on 2 different occasions in my grandfather's dance hall. And you know, my parents were amateur musicians, but music, whether it was jazz or classical music, was in a sense sort of the holy grail in the family. And you know, I was inspired hearing my father play the clarinet, and I learned the instrument, and we played in a marching band together and in a community orchestra. Well, we didn't have a piano in the house. My mother was a singer, and my dad had a clarinet, and you know, they had no way of knowing how essential being able to play the piano was to a young composer's education. But you know, in retrospect, I think sometimes composers become creative people because of something that's missing. You know, and in my case, you know, I couldn't play all those wonderful Beethoven sonatas and Mozart concertos. I couldn't even, you know, play through a piano vocal score of an opera. So I think in a way that sort of motivated me to create my own music. It doesn't mean I wasn't a skilled musician. I got a very rigorous training, both as a performer, as a conductor, and you know, to this day, you know, my training has allowed me to conduct not only my own music but lots of other music. I think my first impulse to write music came probably when I was in the 3rd grade. I don't know how old you are then, maybe 8, 9 years old. That was the 200th anniversary of Mozart's birth, 1956. He was born in 1756. And I went to a very small school in rural New Hampshire, and our teacher read a child's biography of Mozart, which is an extraordinary thing in itself. And I got this image of a young boy who could write symphonies and concertos, and so I went home and tried to do it myself. Of course, then I came face to face with the brutal reality that I needed to have a lot of knowledge about harmony and theory, but that was the beginning. And within 3 or 4 years, I'd written my first orchestra piece and heard it played by a local orchestra. Well, the discussion of operas it's always a dicey one, you know, and particularly when I'm being given an award and feel very honored. If I have to talk candidly about opera, it's a matter of a little bit of discomfort because I'm basically not much of an opera fan. I rarely go, and I remember my first experiences of hearing opera produced incredible cognitive dissonance because I didn't like the sound of the operatic voice. a very wealthy man had heard about me, and he had grown up also in rural New Hampshire, so he invited me down. I think I was about 15 years old. I took the bus down to New York City and was met by his wife and taken to the Metropolitan Opera when it was, further downtown. This is in the era before Lincoln Center, and I heard Aida. All I remember was a very, very large woman and a very, very short man on lifts. And I later found out it was Birgit Nilsson and Richard Tucker. But I didn't get it. Of course, I didn't know what the story was, and I didn't like the sound of it. Later, as a college student, I discovered Mozart, and I discovered a purer form of singing. And I think that helped to transform my feelings. But, basically my inspiration for the singing voice has still been American popular music. I still, when I compose my own work, I tend to think, of my experiences of listening to Stevie Wonder or Joni Mitchell more than, a great opera singer. Well, I grew up in a period when, among other people, Charles Ives was being discovered, and of course Leonard Bernstein, because he was so glamorous and he was so charismatic. When Leonard Bernstein put his finger on something, people paid attention, and one of Bernstein's discoveries was Charles Ives. I mean, only specialists knew about Ives. And I was a young boy, and I bought my first Bernstein recording of Ives, and the idea of a New England composer, someone who loved Emerson and Thoreau, and incorporated his philosophical feelings about life into his music, stimulated me and provided a certain kind of model. My trip across the country has sort of now become a little, like a musical on the road. I wrote about it several times. I wrote about it in my book, Hallelujah Junction, and I didn't mean to turn it into some, myth, but it was emphatically a journey of discovery, what the Germans would call a Wanderjahr, except it turned out to be a Wanderleben, because instead of coming back after 6 months, I found that California had a profound effect on me. Not only the landscape, but the culture. I'd grown up in a small town in New England where everybody had a name like mine and looked like me, and suddenly I found myself in San Francisco with this fabulous mix of all kinds of cultures, and people looked different and spoke different languages, and their music was different, and I think it really opened the door to my own musical expressiveness. Well, I don't think America ever has had a single identifiable style. I mean, certainly during the 30s, the sort of Copeland populist style became very well known, and it continues to this day. But if you had to put your finger on something that typified American music, that made it essentially American, and you would say that no one from Europe or elsewhere would write like this, I would say it is our sense of pulsation, and whether that's in jazz or rock or in, minimalism or in the kind of music that I write, there's always this sense of pulsation. You always feel it. It's a very visceral feeling, and what I do in my music is try to mix a sense of expressiveness and, a sense of intellectual pleasure with what's fundamentally something that's very much from the gut. Historically, things always seem to be bad. I'll talk to people and they'll say, oh, it was so much better 20 years ago, or it was so much better 100 years ago. But, we look at the struggles that Mahler had. Nobody really took him seriously. They just sort of indulged his obsession to compose these symphonies when really what we wanted from him was his conducting. And likewise, if you look at the early era of Duke Ellington, he was only appreciated by black listeners, and everyone laughed at the minimalists and called it needles stuck in the groove music. And it's very much an expected thing that you have to just survive and endure, and if there's quality to what you have to say, people will eventually understand it and appreciate it. You know, a lot of people, particularly people who are not terribly knowledgeable about music, don't understand why there aren't more Mozarts. You know, they don't understand why there aren't 20-year-old geniuses writing music. Why is it that composers these days always look like me, you know? But I think that part of the reason is that Mozart wrote in a time when style was accepted. And it's just that he wrote in the common language better than anyone else. But today, what is expected of an artist is that he or she be absolutely original, that he or she have a unique voice. And it takes time to develop that. I don't think I really matured as an artist and found my own voice until I was about 30 years old. Well, let's see. My name is John Adams. So, you know, quite possibly. You know, I enjoy my ethnicity. Let's put it that way. I enjoy being an American. I enjoy the fact that I am alive and composing at a time when this country, for all its problems, you know, it's terrible social problems and the constant chatter that's going on in the country ideologically, and also the fact that America has historically been very, very wary about artists, has always distrusted them and thought there was something a little suspicious about them. The bottom line is that we're a tremendously artistic country, and we have a great tradition. We are one of the great musical cultures on the globe. And so to be part of that is a terrific thing. Well, I'm amused when people call Nixon in China a classic now because, you know, I guess in a sense it's like beginner's luck. It's somebody who's never played poker before and gets a good hand and wins the first game. You know, you should quit while you're ahead. You know, I didn't know much about opera. I got this commission. You know, we were all very young. Peter Sellars, the stage director, Alice Goodman, the marvelous librettist. And in a sense, perhaps because we didn't know much about opera, and, you know, we weren't intimidated by, you know, an overwhelming responsibility, we just sort of went in and did it. We created something that was maybe quite fresh and shocking. And of course, you know, people like to talk about how Nixon in China is this, you know, repertory piece now, but if you go back and you read the reviews after the premiere, most of them were pretty savage. You know, they ridiculed it and called it a sophomoric exercise, like a college play, and you know, a lot of people were upset that we didn't, you know, weren't more critical of Nixon. I think the Village Voice complained at how well I treated Pat Nixon. So, you know, again, you have to take the long view and realize that a judgment today may prove to be wrong. And that goes for both sides. You know, if I get a glowing review, I have to hold it at arm's distance and say, yeah, maybe, but maybe not. Well, I've been very fortunate that my operas have, the people have continued to want to produce them and hear them. Part of that may be the fact that, you know, I some of the time, not always, but I deal with events and themes and psychological and historical conditions that really touch us as Americans. You know, it isn't just Richard Nixon, who of course is a delicious character for operatic treatment, but it is, you know, it's the historical perplexity of being a president, of being a person with immense power, and what do you do with that power? You know, I'm fascinated to read every day about Obama, and, you know, I wonder what that person's life is like and how he can wake up and just assume those burdens of office. And likewise with the atomic bomb and Dr. Atomic, you know, that single image of the exploding atomic bomb is so expressive of our predicament as Americans in this time. So that may be part of the reason why people want to see my operas and want to produce them. You know, people call me a political composer, but I think that's really wrong. I think it's a misnomer. I'm no more political than Shakespeare or Sophocles. I'm basically taking themes that are at the absolute core of our existence as living beings and bringing them to the level of art. Well, opera is this amazing art form because it is, you know, a synthesis of words and music. And if you have a great director like Peter Sellars, it's more than that. It's dance, it's beautiful lighting, it's the whole sensory experience. That's why when opera doesn't work, it's such a horrible experience and people leave the theater in such a bad mood. But in the rare occasions when everything does come together and people have created a work with great love and care and enormous effort, it can be one of the overwhelming artistic experiences because it brings all those elements together and you get synergy. Well, Peter Sellars found me. You know, he was sort of an alarmingly precocious person. You know, he was already so fully mature as a 22-year-old. I mean, he was always wacky and provocative, but deep down inside, he was a very, very serious artist. And I think he was looking for somebody who was not only serious, but had, you know, music with the power to move people. And, you know, the bottom line is that music is an art form about feeling. I think we tend to forget that, particularly in the era of modernism, where music has become very much a kind of intellectual activity. But ultimately, it's about feeling, and that's why people feel they're swept away, they're deeply moved to tears, or they're deeply offended if they hear something that sounds ugly. And I think that it was my desire and capacity to use music as an art of feeling that drew Peter to my work. I tend to work with a fairly limited group of people. You know, if you look at the great film directors, you often see the same actors, you know, coming back and forth. Antonioni used a very small group of people. Even Woody Allen today tends to work with a very small group of people. I mean, the chronic problem with the opera world is that it becomes a kind of you know, a production machine, and singers fly in, and there's never really time to get deep into the work of art. And, you know, part of this is economic. You have to pay this enormous bill to keep an opera company floating, and the audiences generally want to hear the same, you know, 4 or 5 operas. So I'd say 80 to 90% of the opera that's produced is done under bad conditions, and it's not particularly done with love. And there's no point for me in doing that sort of thing. What I want to do is work with singers who, and directors who, for whom this is the only thing in their life at the moment. And so you have to pick and choose carefully. I'm always looking, even if not actively, sometimes I'm passively looking for a theme. The thing is about an opera is that it's so much work, and it's so much money, and it involves such zealous devotion on the part of everyone, whether it's the producers, the Peter Gelbs of the world, or the conductors, or the stage directors. And there's no point in making an opera if it isn't really important, if it doesn't need to be written, if it isn't something that's going to absolutely command the public attention. And, you know, I know that will come. It was a long time before I found the subject of for Dr. Atomic. And, you know, it may be 5 or 10 years, you know, if I last that long. But I suspect there's, you know, another one down the road. I just haven't quite found the topic, and please don't send me any suggestions because people keep doing that, and you know, it just is overwhelming. Well, because some people wrongly think of me as a a political composer or a composer who always has to have a social issue. Of course, a lot of people asked me after 9/11 whether I was going to write a piece, and I thought it would be only in the worst taste to attempt to compose a work, the theme of which was 9/11. But then, lo and behold, I get a request from the New York Philharmonic, and in the end, I was deeply moved and honored to be asked, because I knew how much New Yorkers had suffered, and I also knew how much the Philharmonic had been involved in going down and playing for the workers at Ground Zero. So I knew that I had to find a way to write this piece, and fortunately I found an angel early on, and that angel was Charles Ives, a piece called The Unanswered Question, which is a very quiet and intimate and both spiritual and philosophically questioning piece, and that sort of became the model for my piece on the Transmigration of Souls. Some creative people just write, and others are sort of polymorphous in their activities. I'm a funny person, because when I'm home, I'm very much a hermit. I don't like to answer the phone, and I tend to have a huge inbox of unanswered emails. But then there's another side of me, which is extrovert, and when I leave home, I go, to another city to conduct or, to curate a festival or something like that. I'm able to turn over a leaf and become the opposite. Instead of the yang, it's the yin. And I find that extrovert attention, even though the transition sometimes is very painful, it's good for me. It tends to, feed the other side of my personality. So, I think I've been able to create a good yin-yang balance in my professional and creative life. It's a very mysterious thing. We need to have enormous technical equipment. If you look at a composer like Brahms, for example, or Bach, their technical chops were just overwhelming. And yet, what happens in the actual act of creation is kind of unknowable. And in fact, you don't want to know too much about it. You don't want it to be too conscious, because once things become too conscious, you tend to repeat yourself. And it's wonderful when you're actually in the creative act to sort of be almost half asleep, to get into that zone where you lose your ego and you lose your self-consciousness, and you just kind of follow this thread. It's sort of like, Hansel and Gretel in the forest. You don't know where it's going to lead, but if it's handled correctly, it can be a voyage of self-discovery, not only for you, but for the listener. I enjoy writing, and I enjoy those writers like Marcel Proust, who wrote about their past, and I thought my past was colorful and interesting. I also wanted to make a personal statement about my work, just as a kind of legacy. But I also wanted to write a book for young musicians, particularly for young composers who could see the struggles that I went through, and the indecisions and wrong turns. I hope it's fundamentally a humble book. It's not a book of self-promotion. It's one more of, this is what happened to me, and the results were both good and at times bad, but that's what life is like.